Hello everyone, so version 3 has come out a bit earlier than expected, and somehow Blade has become even stronger. I know a lot of people were expecting him to get gutted, but I guess he survived. So today I want to go over the changes and explain just how good he is. Starting off, I think what a lot of people are interested in is his amping capabilities, which has been changed in version 3. We do keep that initial 50% damage bonus. However, now the teammate dependent effects have been adjusted. If there's another nihility on the team, we now get 75% ult damage bonus. However, if Blade is solo nihility, instead of 50% follow-up damage bonus, it's now 75% personal damage bonus. So yes, this is pretty similar to what happened to Asheville in his version 3. So what exactly does that mean for us? Is this better or worse? Well, to find that out, let's take a look at my chart which compares every meta-relevant support that's currently in the game. Now, I put a disclaimer on the side if you want to pause and read it, but for the most part, it will be accurate in telling us how strong the amps are. Now, what's interesting is actually how surprisingly balanced the game is in terms of amping, with most supports hovering between 60 and 100%. However, we do have the outliers. Previously, I calculated Blade's amp as 100 total damage bonus, as it did apply to both follow-up and ult users. However, even back then, Blade was still being used for units who couldn't even access the extra 50%, such as Castris, Glaya, and pretty much the other 70% of the roster. As such, I've listed version 3 and technically 1 Blade's normal amp at 219%, which still makes him the best amper in the game outside of E4 Welt, which is crazy. However, when we add in his nihility partner for ults, he now eclipses every unit in the game by a mile. Other supports will legit need a few Eidolons and Lycones to match his current E0S0 amp. Now, I want to look at Asheville real quick. Previously, it was known that Asheville was a disgustingly strong unit, with his initial buffs rivaling version 1 Blade. However, it was changed and put him right next to Evernight. So with that in mind, I really thought Blade would get nerfed, similar to Asheville. But no, that didn't happen. Version 3 technically only nerfed follow-up, so for the rest of the cast, he's actually slightly stronger, and still the best amper in the game. This change buffed Acheron and nerfed follow-up a little bit, so technically a side grade. However, in my opinion, this is actually a sleeper buff. Prior to this, a big issue I noticed with Blade was that he couldn't use his full potential. This is because he basically only got 50 damage bonus for some of his attacks. Now, calculating a standard rotation, follow-up made only around 40% of his damage, so we were getting 50% damage bonus for a bit less than half of his actual output. But now, if we were to use his optimal team of Asheville and Tribi, we now get 75% damage bonus for all of his damage. So that brings us to the next part, his damage. With this change, I do believe he solidifies himself as one of the best DPSs in the game right now. But he also got a nice increase to his already absurd ult. We went from a 300 to 350% HP scaling for AoE. In other words, it now has a 700 to 3500% attack scaling. To understand this significance, we need to understand what a monster this guy was in version 1 and 2. Now, the baseline I'll be using is Asheville, and we'll see Castris a bit later. For Asheville, he's super simple. He's either getting 2-turn or 1-turn ults, which I'll put the MVs on the screen. However, for the rest of the video, I'll primarily focus on 2-turn ult Asheville. Blade, on the other hand, is a bit more tricky, but after seeing countless gameplays, Blade can generally do 4 follow-ups and 1 ult in 3 turns, while managing 100% form uptime. So with that in mind, in terms of multipliers alone, here's the difference. In a single target, Blade slightly lags behind. However, when we put him in Blast or AoE, Blade's all of a sudden doing a metric poop ton of damage. By the way, 1-turn ult Asheville is really OP. Now, I did get a comment on a previous post of mine saying how I shouldn't be comparing a single target to an AoE unit, which they had a pretty good point. So here's Castris as our 5 target comparison. As you can see, Blade's putting up some crazy numbers in his V1. But moving on to version 3 though, the multiplier buff results in roughly a 3 to 5% damage increase. It's not that much, but Blade doesn't even really need anything. Now, multipliers aren't the end all be all. Generally, multiplier times self buffs should give us a pretty good idea on how strong a unit is. However, I did run into a dilemma when trying to calculate this. TLDR, if we include team-wide buffs and debuffs to one's personal stats, we get results such as this. Basically, nothing changes. However, when we see actual gameplay with people using these units together, there's quite a big difference in the results because of a difference in stat distribution. Basically, Blade has significantly higher team amp versus self buffs compared to casters and Blade. For reference, he only gets 100 crit worth of stats, while Ashwell gets 300. So in practice, aka the new calcs I'll show on the screen, the results are actually much closer than you'd think. Regardless, these numbers still put him as one of the best DPSs in the game, not to mention all his buffs and synergy. Now moving on, and to finish up with Blade, his follow-up skill now actually drains HP, but the trade-off is that everything in general consumes a bit less HP, and you also get damage resist and also healing bonus while you're in his enhanced form. This in itself is likely a side grade, as you're simply trading off the damage taken by enemies to now him taking damage himself. The main thing though tied with this is that Blade no longer works too well with shields. This is because his skill cannot be used anymore when he is at 1 HP, which is an issue because he doesn't really have any self heals. However, there are some ways to offset this. I've seen some people talking about S1 Dan Hung PT's Light Cone, but more interestingly, I saw this Reddit user talk about the Wuthering Snow set. For people who want to use Preservation or run Blade as your pseudo sustain, this unironically is a pretty good option. But besides that, there was also the E2 nerf, which basically removed the infinite damage combo. So as of version 3, Blade will keep his universalness whilst being an insane damage dealer and also support. As it currently stands, in terms of pull value, you just cannot go wrong with him. He is currently being used in almost every team while being either the best or second best option. Now, with how strong he is currently, I wouldn't count out the possibility of a sneakier version 4 or 5 nerf. But he has been able to get past version 3 without any, so who knows. As for my channel, I likely will make one more video about Blade, and then we'll make some other deep dive video about something. Speaking of something, if y'all have any interesting video ideas or takes, just drop it in the comments as I likely will see it. I remember one asking me to make a video about what happened in Blade in Qingliu, which I may do, but we'll just have to see. But besides that guys, good luck on y'all's Evanescia pulls, and I'll see y'all next time. Peace.